All right, hello and welcome to Conversations about Science and Society, the US Census Data Reliability and Reproducible Research. My name is Alan Love. I'm the director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science and the principal investigator of the Many Phases of Reproducibility project at the University of Minnesota that is sponsoring tonight's event, and I will be hosting and moderating. Now, this project, The Many Phases of Reproducibility, is motivated by a desire to understand and promote more rigorous and reliable research across the sciences. And as a part of that, we want to bring those conversations out into a wider audience, especially in cases where the public trust in science is relevant to understanding things like government policy. Now, just a procedural note, we are recording this for viewing later. And at the end, when we do the question and answer, we're going to do that via index cards. Those of you who are here have them at your seats. And so you can write those and pass them to the side at any point in time for the question and answer time. So let me say a little bit more about reproducibility and why that's our central theme. It's been a growing concern with respect to the methods in and results from a variety of sciences, from cancer biology to social psychology, and a major component of these discussions is statistical methodology, something that is central to the constitutional requirement of enumerating the population to determine the apportionment of seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, as well as taxation and the allocation of federal funding. The U.S. Census is one of the largest data collection and analysis efforts in the world. The results have an impact on our everyday lives. It involves not only a variety of advanced preparation, but also many kinds of after-the-fact studies. Questions like the following are ones that have to be addressed. How do researchers ensure that data emerging from these efforts is reliable? How do researchers learn from past efforts and improve them for the next census? Additionally, once this data is released, how is it curated for use in the research of diverse scientists? And how does this support reliable, reproducible answers to diverse questions about human behavior and society? Our aim tonight is to better understand how the U.S. Census works, why it is trustworthy, and how its data are utilized in an ongoing manner, while simultaneously appreciating the conceptual difficulties related to rigor and reproducibility around these efforts. Our panelists hail from the US Census Bureau in Washington, D.C., and the Minnesota Population Center here in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota. Let me now introduce them to you. To my immediate left is Brian DeVos from the US Census Bureau, where he is a program manager in the Decennial Census Management Division, where he covers a lot of different things, including system integration, program architecture, stakeholder level testing of data collection instruments, recruiting, hiring, and training of temporary field staff, IT, operational build-out of temporary field offices, help desk support for temporary field staff and distribution, and provisioning of mobile devices to support the census and field tests. It's a man that wears many hats. And then to his left is Tim Kennel. He's the Assistant Division Chief for Statistical Methods in the Decennial Statistical Studies Division at the US Census Bureau, where he leads the statistical design of the post-enumeration survey, one of two operations used to measure coverage in the census, and we'll talk about that more. For the 2020 census, he also led the count imputation team to fill in missing information about addresses, and his research focuses on coverage errors, non-response bias, statistical calibration, and variance estimation. And then finally, on the end, David Van Riper from the Minnesota Population Center. He's there the Director of Spatial Analysis in the Institute for Social Research and Data Innovation, where he consults with members on spatial analysis needs, including project planning, data acquisition, creation, processing, and grant writing. He also is co-principal investigator on 2 NIH-funded grants. The first provides access to historical and contemporary small area data, including GIS mapping files for the US. And the second allows users to securely geocode data and attach neighborhood characteristics to the geocoded output. Now, although most of us have likely heard about the US Census on multiple occasions, whether in school or otherwise, I think the best way to start tonight would be to review some of the basics from our speakers who work at the US Census Bureau. Additionally, since each of them has specific expertise, I would like both to take us into a little more detail on those aspects of the census that they are directly involved with. Brian, let's begin with you and focus on what happens leading up to the census, and then we'll turn to Tim for his perspective, focusing on what happens in the aftermath of the census. Brian.
Thank you, Ham. So the primary goal of the decennial census is to collect everyone once, only once, and in the right place. Basically, this is our foundation for all the decisions we make in designing the collection of the census. First, we start by asking some simple questions. What do we need to collect? How did we collect this data in the past? And how can we become more efficient and cost-effective in collecting our data? Is there any ways that we could improve the data quality that we collect? And then lastly is what kind of new technological solutions are available out there for us to improve our efficiencies also. For the 2020 census, we began designing the 2020 census in 2008. That's when we pulled our team together. And back then, we had three of our main objectives, three of many objectives. The first one being provide an internet self-response option available to the public, which we've never done before. We're wanting to move from more paper data collection to automated data collection, and then lastly, integrate the idea of adaptive design into our enumeration.
So wait just a moment. I think we need a little bit more detail there. What is adaptive design of enumeration?
Adaptive design of enumeration is a constant updating of how and when we're going to enumerate households. Basically, we have all this administrative data. We have in-house data for addresses, all our contact history, and it's a constant reevaluation of the best way to reach out to people. Through adaptive design, we're able to modify the contact methods that we use. Whether or not we have quality issues in the field, we're better able to react to those. Whether there's an area that needs more staffing, and then lastly, what kind of targeted advertising can we do to try to improve some of the responses in the area.
Okay, that's helpful. I'd like to go back to the other objectives you mentioned regarding internet self-response and data collection on mobile devices, because those are obviously newer developments in census practice. Can you say more about those?
Yes, for internet self-response, at the very beginning of the decade, we begun our development for this. We had several nationwide content tests that we conducted. Our sample sizes for those was 1 million respondents. And during those tests, we were looking basically to see how the public react to the new option. Did they have any issue providing information over the internet? Did they feel safe doing it? And then also on our end, could we make their data secure? I mean, that's the best way to get people to give their information out. For mobile data collection, that poses a whole nother set of challenges. For our field reps, for non-response follow-up, which is our largest field operation, we hire approximately 400,000 enumerators to do that. Those enumerators, they're basically field interviewers, trying not to use census lingo. For 40 hours, they get 40 hours worth of training before they go knock on people's doors. And for that 40 hours, that training covers filling out all their HR paperwork, and we have a lot of paperwork for them to fill out, taking the oath that they're going to protect public data. Then they have to learn the actual operation. And then on top of that, we have them run through field scenarios. And then the very last part of their training is how to use our mobile device and the mobile application. So since they have all that to learn, we got to make sure that our mobile apps are very user-friendly. And then on top of that, I mean, it makes the interviewer's job easier, but we also had to make sure that the mobile device was protected and secure, our mobile app was protected and secured. And then these mobile devices had to be used all across the country, and we have dead zones, so we had to make sure that our device, our mobile app worked on the offline. In a dead zone, we were still able to collect data. So that was a big challenge for the mobile devices.
So what would you say were some of the key accomplishments with respect to those objectives? And in particular, can you speak to how that gives us increased confidence about the outcome of the census effort, say, in comparison to previous census efforts?
Yeah, our biggest accomplishment for 2020 is the internet self-response. Our big fear going into, at the very beginning of the decade, is we do not want to be another healthcare.com. We wanted to make sure that is available to people. So we took a lot of precautions there. The best result we had was during the entire duration of this 2020 census, not once did we have any downtime for internet self-response, and we didn't have any data breaches. So that was a success there. And in addition, the moment we turned it on and made it available to the public, the more people used it than we had predicted, which was a very happy situation there. The other accomplishment was moving from paper data collection to automated data collection. Passed in 2010, a day in the life of a numerator was basically, I get up in the morning, I meet my field supervisor, I turn in my paper timesheet, I turn in all my paper questionnaires that I collected for the day, and then the field supervisor would give me a whole new workload to work. And then at that point, it was up to me, the field interviewer, to figure out how am I going to catch all these people? You know, how am I going to do my job? And that I was given that same workload to finish. It was mine and mine only. Now in 2020, we moved to this mobile design with a heavy influence of adaptive design to it, where the day before I go to work, I enter my work availability. I say, I want to work 10 to 4. And then I send that up to our control system. Our control system says, Brian's going to work 10 to 4. This is where Brian lives, and these are all the cases in Brian's area, and this is the best times for Brian to reach out to these people. So it provided a prioritized case list that told me to go to 101 Main Street first, 105 Main Street second, in both directions for driving, but also when people would be available at home. And all that information was based on admin data we had, plus our contact history. So throughout the day, I send all the data up to the control system, and the control system takes all that data, collects it, learns the best way, and then the next day it sends a brand new fresh caseload out to the numerators. So it's a constant state of learning and adapting to what's going on in the field.
So that really seems like there was some big changes in how the census operated from 2010 to 2020.
Yes.
All right, I think now we've got a better sense of, you know, how the 2020 census in particular was developed and prepared. I think we need to turn to Tim here and hear a little bit about what happens afterwards. So especially as a reminder, because we all think, well, it's 2022, why are we talking about the census? Isn't it over? And Tim would say, no, there's more work to be done. So.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of work that happens after the data collection for the decennial census is complete. We review and scrutinize the data. We look for duplicates and other potential errors. We look for outliers and anomalies. We also inject some random noise into some data products to help protect the identity of our respondents.
Wait a second. You said we inject noise into the data?
Yep.
And we fill in missing data? What's going on there?
Okay. So the noise injection is a procedure we use to protect our respondents. So we may say someone will report one age, and we'll jitter it a little bit. Or one block might have 30 people, and we'll say maybe there are 32 people there, or 29, or 27. And it's a systematic process that's open and transparent. We're using open source, methods for this, telling people this is the amount of noise that we're injecting. But with modern day computers and a huge amount of data available on the web, it's sort of easy. Anyone can do this pretty much on their laptop. Get this big data and try to match it up to the census and find out who lives where and their characteristics. And we want to prevent that. And so the way to do that we've chosen to for the 2020 census is to inject noise into certain data products to prevent this sort of hacking or reverse engineering of the census results. Title 13 is part of what governs the Census Bureau. It's a law that allows the Census Bureau to do its work as we've sort of been doing it. And that title says that we have to maintain the confidentiality of each individual person that we have, and we can only produce sort of aggregated statistics, but you can't go back and identify an individual person according to that law. And so if we were to release personally identifiable information, that would be a violation of the law and a big problem for us. So the other thing that we do is we also fill in data that you mentioned. A lot of effort is put into filling in or imputing any missing characteristics from the census. Some respondents, they'll skip their age, race, or Hispanic origin questions, and we fill in that missing data. You might wonder, well, how do you know that you got it right when you fill in the missing data? You didn't get their response. And honestly, we don't really know the actual response that the person would have given to us. This is a statistical procedure we use, and we try as hard as we can to get it right, but we'll often be wrong for any individual person. However, on average, our imputations do a lot of good and are much better than not doing anything, just leaving the holes there, because people who respond, just in general, tend to be different than those people who don't respond. And so if we leave those blanks, we're not giving credit to those people who don't respond, and we're sort of biased towards those people who responded. We fill in the missing data using a statistical technique. That's what we call imputation. And it's commonly done, but it isn't something that most people think about. So I'll try to give you some details about how and why we fill in this missing data, and I'll go on for quite a while here because it's sort of complicated and very interesting to me, so it's one of my passions. So there are several ways we fill in the missing data. I'll start with count imputation, which is the process we use to fill in missing information about addresses. For a variety of reasons, there are some addresses where we're not able to determine if a housing unit existed at that address. Maybe the address was in a gated community and we didn't have access to it, or maybe a road to the address was not accessible. Maybe there was a big rainstorm that washed out the road and we can't get to it anymore, or a volcano erupted and covered the road and we can't get to it because it's protected. We just can't get to it. So there's a number of reasons why we can't access addresses that we want to get information from. For other addresses, we confirmed the existence of a housing unit. So we got to the address, we found there's a housing unit, but we're not able to get a population count. And when I say population count, that could be 0 people, meaning it's vacant, or it could be any number of 1, 2, 3, 4, up to, we cap it, I think, at 9 people for our work, but there could be lots of people at an individual address. So in situations like that, we perform count imputation. We used information about the address itself that we might have from other sources, administrative records and whatnot, and we also use information from neighboring addresses in the area to impute a status of non-existent or a population count if necessary. Now, it turns out that vacant units tend to be geographically clustered, so we try to take the spatial clustering of the data into account. Count imputation contributed to census counts. So usually we try to not do anything that will impact the count, so then collect the data and we let the reported counts speak for themselves. But this is really one of the only areas that we actually do a statistical process. It's well documented and transparent about it, so people should understand what we're doing, and we're clear about it. But it does change the census counts. It's not perfect by any means, but it's better than assuming that all the unresolved records, unresolved addresses don't exist, or assuming that they're all vacant, which is sort of what you might tend to do and say, oh, you didn't get to that address, so you called vacant, and that address does not contribute to the population, and that would be probably more harm than our statistical process. Now, the second type of imputation is characteristic imputation. We use this process to fill in missing demographic characteristics of people who didn't report their age, race, sex, or Hispanic origin on the census form. For this type of imputation, we used a variety of techniques to fill in the missing data. We drew from sources of information such as administrative records and the previous census reports to see if we already had characteristics available. We also made some assignments based on other variables. For example, we looked at the first names and assigned a sex for names that were dominated by one sex. Like Alan would be a male and Elizabeth would be a female. It's not always the case, but it's pretty common. So we're not going to be perfect about it, but most Allens are male. So, and then those that are sort of in the middle, maybe Pat, could be male or female, we're less likely to just make an assignment. We'll be using a different process for those. We also looked at other characteristics of respondents in the household or the neighborhood to fill in missing characteristics. So if the parents reported being black alone and the children didn't have a race reported, we'll probably impute the race of the children to be black as well. Not always, or always, we've got over 300 million people in the country, and we're not going to get it right all the time, but we try as hard as we can, and we're going to do the best job we can. To be transparent then about this process, because if we were behind a closed door and wouldn't share our imputation with others, they might criticize us and say you're fudging the census or something. So we're very transparent about this, and we report the amount of imputation done to the census, and we openly discuss our statistical processes to impute missing counts and characteristics. At the end of the census, we provide a lot of information about the counting process and the quality of the census data collection. Now, I work on one of those efforts called the PES.
Wait. The PES? What is the PES? That sounds like jargon. We better unpack it.
We live in the world of alphabetical soup at the Census Bureau, like any other government agency. So the PES is the post-enumeration survey, and between post and enumeration, there's a hyphen. That means it's after the enumeration, after sort of the census is done. If you don't have that hyphen, that would be a post-enumeration. You're counting like posts, like in a field. It's post-enumeration survey, and that's one of two ways used to measure the coverage of the census. The other is demographic analysis, and I'll set that aside for now. So is this mic still working?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Coverage refers to how well the census covers the population. Were the census counts too low or too high compared to the true number of people?
Hold on a second, Tim. I think we need a new mic.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So we'll pause there and just, why don't
Maybe
we?
I'll use.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, you go ahead, Tim, and we'll get
Okay.
Brian the other one.
So let's talk about the PES. So the coverage refers to how well the census covers the population. Were the census counts too low or too high compared to the true number of people in the United States? The PES uses a statistical technique called capture-recapture to provide an independent estimate of the number of people in the country. The independent estimate is compared to the census counts to show us where the census counts were aligned with the independent estimates and where they disagree. The method used to estimate the population size was originally developed to estimate the number of fish in a pond, but it's been adapted to estimating the size of human populations. To estimate the number of fish in a pond, a net would be thrown into the water to catch some fish. The fish would then be marked and then thrown back into the pond, safely and happily. After a while, another net would be cast and more fish would be caught. Biologists then count the number of fish in the second capture that had marks and how many didn't have marks. With this information and some statistics, the number of fish in a pond can be estimated. Now, the number of people in the U.S. is the first capture is the census. So you think about that's the first capture is the census. The second recapture is an independent survey called the post-enumeration survey. And that's a different staff walks around sample areas and they list addresses and they interview households completely from scratch without any other information. And without, certainly without any information from the census. So that's sort of the second catch. We create our own, we now have two systems, the census system or census list and the PES list. Then we match the people in the PES to the census to estimate how many people in the PES were caught in the census. As long as there's statistical independence between the census and the PES enumerations, we can estimate the population of the US. The estimated net coverage error is the difference between the census counts and the PES estimate. Of course, many things can go wrong in the survey and estimation process. As a survey methodologist and a statistician, I think in terms of the many sources of random and systematic variation in the survey life cycle. Random errors and biases can threaten the reliability and reproducibility of the census. They can also threaten the reliability and reproducibility of the coverage estimates themselves of the PES. So it can impact both the census and the PES.
Do you want to?
Yeah, that's what I want to sort of say.
I know there's a lot you can say about that, and
Yeah.
I'm definitely starting to see that you engage in a very serious post-mortem autopsy of the census effort. I think maybe what would be helpful is to say a little bit more about the factors that contribute to variability in the large-scale enumeration. What's kind of at the back of that variability?
Yeah, the variability of surveys is usually divided into two components. There's sampling error, and then there's non-sampling error. And those are mutually exclusive and exhaustive of all the errors. Sampling error measures the variability of the estimates you'd get from different samples. If we had selected a different sample for the PES, we would likely have gotten a different coverage estimate. And if we had repeated the PES 100,000 or million times, would have gotten a lot of different estimates. But those estimates, based on statistical theory, would be centered around one number. If you average them, you get this average number, and those estimates are going to bounce around that one number. Some, very far away, maybe if you got a bad sample, some close by, but we'll get different estimates based on the sampling. The sampling error tells us how spread out the estimates will be around that average estimate. So that's sampling error. Then there's non-sampling error, and that can also add variability to the estimates. Any random process in the data collection or processing can add additional noise to the data. For example, when we ask the same person what their age is, sometimes the person will round up, sometimes round down, sometimes not round at all, sometimes they just won't respond. Now, depending on how the person is feeling, it could be just a flip of the coin in their head. They've got some mechanism that says round up, heads round up, tails round down. You're feeling grumpy today, don't answer. We'll get a different number. So it's sort of depending on their feeling, we'll get a different answer, and it could be sort of this randomness in the process of reporting data. And that randomness we call response variance, and that adds additional noise to the data, because if we repeat the same process over and over again, we'll get different results. Same sample over and over again, different results, because people respond differently based on that flip of the coin in their head. Non-sampling error can also be systematic. That means there's a trend to it. For example, if the person always rounds down about their age, so they're feeling really old and they always feel old, they're always going to round down, in that case, the response would not be adding variability, but would be biased. Survey methodologists are concerned with all the types of error that add to both variability, that's random noise, or biases, these systematic errors. Some standard questions we must address are whether our samples are appropriately representative, how similar the survey respondents are to the non-respondents, whether all respondents understand the questions in a similar way, we try to measure the variability and errors of our estimates over various samples and error profiles. When we can't measure errors, we acknowledge them and discuss how they might impact our results. For the census, the PES estimates the coverage error of the census. For the PES, a variety of reports describe the PES methods and the possible errors. So we reported the uncertainty in our estimates, and this is difficult, especially with a national and diverse audience.
So you mentioned just now that you're aiming for a sample that is appropriately representative. And I think that's something that in a lot of different areas of science, there's a concern about. Can you say a little bit more about that, what it means for the sample to be appropriately representative, especially for a national and diverse audience?
Yeah, there really isn't a great definition of a representative sample. For some, a representative sample is one where the sample looks like the population from which the sample was drawn. For others, including myself, a representative sample is one where the people in the sample represent themselves and a known number of other people. Ideally, when you add up all the people in the sample and everyone they represent, you will get the full population. Scientific samples, where everyone has a known probability of selection, allows us to use the sample to infer about the population. The process of making statements about the population from a sample is called inference or estimation.
Okay, so that definitely, now I want you to expand on estimation, because that's also really interesting.
Okay, great. I'll be glad to. When we conduct a survey, we only have one sample, and we certainly use our one sample to make estimates about the population. But as I said earlier, another sample would likely result in a different estimate. Thus, the sampling process makes our estimates noisy. As a sampling statistician, I never get to see the truth. However, I can use my sample and statistics to make statements about the truth. I just have to be humble and acknowledge the uncertainty and inherent randomness in our estimates, and avoid sort of statements about the truth, because we can just see a glimpse through this random process of a survey design. Now, for the PES, we recognize the variability of our coverage estimates, and we tried to be modest and careful about the way we talked about our estimates. For example, we didn't say the census undercounted the population or undercounted certain groups or overcounted certain groups, but rather we say that we estimated undercounts or overcounts. We don't say for sure, we say we estimated them. And it's often been cited that the PES reported that the census undercounted the population in 6 states. Such statements make it sound like we know the truth and know for sure 6 states were undercounted. In reality, the census counts were indeed lower than the PES estimates in 6 states, but we don't know the actual number of people in the state, so we can't say for sure that the census counts were lower than the true population in any state. Also, because of sampling error, 1 out of every 10 comparisons we make will be wrong. We compared the state census counts, so the state level, to the PES state estimates for a total of 50 comparisons, 1 for each state. So we would expect 5 states to appear to have a statistically significant undercount or overcount when there really wasn't a statistically significant undercount or overcount, just because of statistical design. We have this 90% rule, and that's where we know we're going to make mistakes on the average of 1 out of every 10. Unfortunately, we don't know which of the 14 states that had a statistically significant undercount or overcount were statistically significant by chance, and which really had an undercount or overcount. In my mind, this is not a reproducibility or reliability problem. This is part of the statistical theory that we have, and it acknowledges uncertainty and randomness in the sampling process. Communicating uncertainty to the public has been one of the challenges of any statistical agency. And communicating randomness and uncertainty is very important to transparency, credibility, and understanding the limits of our data. So in summary, because of the errors in the PES, we don't think of the estimates of the PES as truth, but as a useful measure of the coverage of the census, and its errors informed by additional data that we've collected. It helps us better understand the accuracy and usefulness of the census counts, even though it's not the absolute, truth.
So in my experience of analyzing scientific reasoning across different areas of inquiry, a lot of what you're describing sounds like similar patterns of after-the-fact sort of vetting of what has been done in order to assess whether or not one can rely on the results, and that's actually what gives us confidence in the outcome, that we have done that after-the-fact inquiry. Is that correct? Is that the way you think about it at the census?
Indeed, yeah. The census has been described as the most expensive denominator in the country. The census is used by many, many different stakeholders. And because we don't know all of the many uses of census data, we strive for accuracy across the board. The census counting and processing activities are thoroughly tested and reviewed. However, it is the evaluation and assessment efforts, such as the post-enumeration survey, that help us understand the limits and reliability and reproducibility of the census. The estimates from the PES help us understand the quality of the census, but these measures themselves are subject to systematic and random errors. In the past decades, sometimes we even performed evaluations of the PES. That is, we did an evaluation of the census. We didn't do much of that for the 2020 census, but we certainly tried to acknowledge and discuss some of the potential sources of error in the PES data. Regardless, I hope the PES coverage estimates are helpful, useful, and contributed to the story of the census. Statistical theory tells us that if we repeated the census or the PES again, we almost certainly would get different results. Nevertheless, this does not mean that the census counts or the PES estimates are not reliable or of poor quality. Randomness is one of the statistician's best friends, sometimes our enemy. We built quality into our data collection methods, and we use high-quality statistical processes. So it is that process that we try to build quality into that helps us understand the outcome and the credibility and reliability of the end result.
Okay, so to this point, David has been sitting very quietly at the end of the table, listening to Brian and Tim go through the nuts and bolts of the census on the front end and the back end. But I think now we need to hear from David a little bit on what gets done with this data. So David, can you help us see this and maybe start by talking about the kinds of data that we get from the census?
Absolutely. The decennial census provides us with billions of pieces of information describing the demographic characteristics and demographic composition of the United States, from the national level, right, the count of the total population in the US, all the way down to population counts for individual city blocks. For example, we could go to the data right now and figure out how many people were enumerated on the city block on which we're standing. It's probably 0 because there's no housing units here, but we could drill down to that fine grain of a level. Other common geographies for which we get decennial census data include cities, counties, and American Indian and Alaskan Native tribal lands. So I think of the data we get from the decennial census in kind of 3 parts. We've got these geographies, right, over which the data are collected and then tabulated. But then there's the questions that are asked on the census, and there's 10 questions that are asked on the decennial census. And then those provide information on both the population, the individual characteristics of people, and the characteristics of the housing units within which we reside. So in terms of the description of the populations and households and families, I call that the population data. We get information on the counts of people by sex, by age, by race, by Hispanic origin. And so we get, when we talk about age counts, they're typically tabulated in terms of bins. So look at the count of persons who are age 0 to 4, the count of persons who are age 5 to 9, and then up to the count of persons age 85 and over. We'll get the counts of individuals identifying as a black alone, Asian alone, American Indian or Alaska Native alone, white alone. We get the count of persons who identify as being of Hispanic origin or not. Remember, this is all self-response, so it's how people view themselves, and they choose to check off various boxes on the form. And all of that is kind of tabulated both individually, so counts of age, counts of sex, counts of race, but also cross-tabulations. So the number of people aged 0 to 4 who are black alone, the number of people who are aged 15 to 17 who identify as Asian alone. Those are the types of tabulations that are published in the decennial census for persons. But we also get a lot of housing unit information. So for example, we get information on the number of housing units that are owned or rented. We get information on the number of vacant housing units in various levels of geography. And all of that's very helpful for, urban planners who are looking at, are there places for infill development? There's lots of vacant housing units. The decennial census is really the source for that type of information. And then we get information on households, right? So, for example, we get information on the number of married couple families that reside in a particular neighborhood or in a particular county. We get counts of individuals who are 65 and over who live alone. Which during COVID, for example, was a particularly susceptible group, right? If you were living alone and you were 65 and over, you could be very isolated. It could have been very hard for you during that time to get out and to get help. If we have counts of where those people are living, that can inform interventions. We can get out and help those people and target different interventions. So that's the type of data we get out of the census for lots of geographies, and it's an incredibly rich and useful data set.
So I think it's worth pausing here and sort of inviting you to say a little bit more about how you and the census more generally kind of is understanding the gathering of data about race. So I think already somebody who's listening will have detected that there's a list of categories for race, and then there's an addition about Hispanic ethnicity or not. And I think that might be, wait, what's going on there? So can you say a little bit about sort of how this data is collected and aggregated?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Census Bureau, in the 2020 decennial census, the Bureau has a race question where there's a set of check boxes for 6 categories: white alone, black or African American alone, Asian alone, American Indian or Alaska Native alone, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander alone, some other race alone, and 2 or more races. And so you can choose as many of those as you want to. You can check off as many of those boxes. Then there's a separate question for whether or not you identify as Hispanic or not. And you check one of 2 boxes. You either identify as Hispanic or you don't. And then the Bureau does a lot of processing of those data. And new in 2020 was write-ins for identifying if you're white alone. You could write in, I identify as English or Irish, and that was a new addition in 2020 that was not on the 2010 census. All those data then get categorized and classified with a really long list of categories that the Census Bureau published, and then people are then kind of assigned various categories, and that's what goes into the tabulation. Now, one thing that's important about the decennial census compared to other surveys that the Bureau does is that it's the one data product that we have that allows us to drill down to a fine-grained set of racial categories or American Indian tribal groups. It's one of the best data sources for that. So some of these tribal groups and some specific race groups are quite small, right? We're talking about less than 100 people who identify as members of particular tribes. The decennial census is really the only source that provides reasonable and reliable counts for those groups. Mm-hmm. Other surveys that the Bureau does, they just don't have the sample density to be able to produce those types of estimates. Mm-hmm. So that's why this is such an important product for some groups of the population is really the only source of good information about them.
Yeah, that's great. So now that we have a better idea of the wealth of data that's coming out of the census, it would be helpful to have an illustration of how that data gets used, say, to study urban planning or education, and also why, once that study with that data is done, we have confidence in it.
Yeah. So the decennial census has a myriad of uses, both in the scientific realm, but also just in planning and trying to figure out how is our country changing, and what do we need to know about how it's changing. So one of the ways in which these data are used are by school districts, right? So school districts use the counts of people who reside in that school district to figure out whether or not what the future enrollment is going to look like, right? If you look at the number of people age 0 to 4 in your school district, you're like, whoa, there's like 50% more people age 0 to 4 than I expected. That's going to have a concrete impact on whether or not you have enough teachers in first grade for the upcoming school year, or what's going to come in the next 3 to 4 years. Do I have enough schools? Do I have to plan to build more schools? Because that takes a long time to come into effect. Mm-hmm. You've got to have that data to work from, and then the decennial census provides that baseline.
Okay, so, and make sure I want to get to the point about confidence, right? So in those counts, what's the confidence coming from, and why are we so sure of that?
So it's challenging, right? So at a national level, the post-enumeration survey is helpful for us to get a sense of the undercount or overcount for age groups, right? So Tim's group would provide an estimate of the undercount or overcount of persons aged 0 to 4, right? And that's at the national level. But the PES is not designed to drill down to sub-state levels of analysis. So at the school district level, you're going to have to probably triangulate with the 2020 decennial census. You may want to look back at prior censuses and triangulate, like, how good was the data in 2010, mm-hmm. right? Was that then indicative of what we got in our schools in the next few years? You've got to kind of triangulate that. Unfortunately, I wish Tim could have a much larger budget to do a much more dense PES, because then we could estimate some of these small area statistics. We don't have that, but entities have to work with their local knowledge to figure out what that confidence and reliability is. And the other thing I'll say is, like, if you're planning for a school, right, and the count is off by, right, you expect a certain number and it's off by a lot, you that may or may not have an impact on what you plan to do. You kind of have to triangulate around that.
Right. Yeah, so it does seem like one of the things that's really important there is this continual tracking back to the different sources of data and analysis that has been done in the past, and cross-check and recheck, mm-hmm. and that's a lot of where the confidence comes. Well, so we've covered a lot of ground here, and I'm sure, as you can tell from our speakers' enthusiasm, they could say a lot more. But I want to start making the transition into the time for Q&A. So I want to remind folks that you have index cards at your seats. If you have questions, please go ahead and start jotting those down. More than one is fine also. And while you are doing that, we're going to kind of do a rapid fire final round here with our panelists and get their thoughts on a couple poignant questions. So Brian, I'm going to come back to you for our first one of these, because you have your own experience in the field and you spend a lot of time working with temporary field staff. So in thinking about temporary field staff, what's the most difficult thing you encounter? And maybe on the flip side of that, what's one of the most encouraging things that you encounter about temporary field staff?
With temporary field staff, the range of hires that we get anything from college-age students to retirees. So trying to set up a system and solutions to support both is difficult. I've sat in on training sessions where someone was given a laptop and it looked like the first time they've ever used a laptop. So here this person had to learn the operation and learn how to use a laptop prior to going into the field. Also had people, we had to teach them how to pinch and zoom on their smartphone. So simple things that some people take for granted. Not all of our staff have that. But once they get over that technical hurdle, some of these people that may struggle with the technical aspect of it, they may end up being the best enumerators out there once they get with the general public. We give them all the tools to do their work, but to get to like knock on a door and have a person answer. But once a person answer, then it becomes more, it goes from the science to the art. There's an art to getting people to actually respond and give the information. So that's the difficult part, is the technology part of it, and also trying to get people over the technological hump so they can work through it.
Okay. So Tim, I imagine that it's possible that you have statistical dreams because of your interest in statistics. So I'm going to ask you to go to statistics dreamland for a moment and ask you if you could eliminate one form of variability or coverage error from the efforts put in by the census, what would it be?
That's a fantastic question, and actually one that I've grappled with a lot recently. For the 2020 post-enumeration survey, I worked very hard to remove one error called model or synthetic bias. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this. And it's actually, not pie in the sky. It was like real. We actually did this. So in 2010, no states had a statistically significant net coverage error based on the 2010 PES. Was this because the 2010 census was the best census ever? Or was it because the PES state level estimates were so variable we couldn't detect undercounts or overcounts as well? I don't have a definitive answer to that question, but the methods used to create state coverage error in 2010 had this model error, which relied on very strong assumptions and resulted in biased state coverage estimates. We planned for this. We knew it all along. We quantified it and we shared it to the public. These are variable estimates because we use this methodology called synthetic estimation. It results in biased estimates. We tried really hard to measure this bias, which is really hard to do, making a whole lot of assumptions. And then we said, okay, here's how the end result is. It's going to be this variable. It's going to have this much error with this point estimate for the state. Well, that estimate of the variability was quite large, and were we able to detect any significant differences for the states in 2010? No. We openly explained this. I'm not sure it was generally understood outside the Census Bureau. So, I worked hard, realizing this after the 2010 census, to remove synthetic bias. This resulted in some increases in sampling error to the 2020 estimates of census coverage error. Now, the choice to remove synthetic bias also resulted in not being able to estimate census coverage at the county or place level, so sort of sub-state estimates. So removing synthetic error, which I was very happy about, I think that was the right thing to do, but it came at a cost. It meant that we had a small increase of sampling variance, and also were not then able to produce sub-state estimates. But I think our estimates didn't have that bias, and it was more understandable that the data we're producing is actually what we're seeing in that state, rather than drawing on just saying this state has this, the census was this bad in this state because it had this many people of this age group or this race group, which tend to be undercounted. So it was sort of trying to remove that assumption.
Okay, and then finally, David, I think that if the Minnesota Population Center had a bumper sticker, it would say, "We crunch data." And so I think it would be really interesting to hear from you, what's one study that has used the US Census data and really you're proud of it and think it achieved something really important in illuminating or helping inform certain kinds of policy decisions?
That's a great question and really hard to answer, so I'm actually not going to answer that. But the work that we do at the Minnesota Population Center is really in service of scientists and researchers around the world. We do a ton of work to standardize census and survey data over time and across space. And we then offer those data up free of charge. And I think we're most proud of the fact that we've built a data product that's used by over 300,000 researchers around the world and is cited more than 3,000 times a year in academic publications. Oh. And that reach that we've developed in the work that we've done over the last 25, 30 years is something that we are very proud of. And I will say too, just so people know, right, that today the founder of the Minnesota Population Center received a MacArthur Genius Grant for the work that he did over the last 30 years to democratize access to this data. And that's a pretty cool honor for a social scientist to get. And that the University of Minnesota has been the home of that. And I think that's something we're quite proud of, and that he had that vision.
Yeah, that's quite amazing and quite an achievement. Okay, so we definitely have more bases to cover, but now I want to hear some of the things that have come up in people's minds during this time. So I'll just grab a stack of the index cards here, and we'll start unpacking those questions. All right, and so these are going to be relevant to different individuals, and so people can chime in as they see fit. Okay, so let me start with a question about filling in the missing data. Does the filling in of missing data account for the large population of people experiencing homelessness during data collection? If not, is this population considered negligible? And let me pause there, and then there's a follow-up on that. But so let's talk about the homelessness during data collection.
Okay, that's a fantastic question.
Are you on? There. Let's see.
Okay. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so yeah, I spoke about the filling in of the missing data, the countibutation in terms of addresses, right? So not everybody has an address. So the countibutation procedures refer to address level data. So people who don't have addresses, that does not apply. So how are people counted who don't have addresses? And I'm sure Brian might. I'll give you.
I can take that one.
You can take it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great.
We have an operation called Targeted Non-Sheltered Outdoor Locations, also known as T-Night. It occurs March 31st. And what we do is we go out, I think it's 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the morning. And we have large groups of enumerators walking the street. And they go around counting the homeless at night where they're more sedentary, and that's how we count them.
All right, so there's a follow-up here, and I want to get to it, but it's slightly different because it's not about homelessness, it's about race, and it's about the possible role that census data might play regarding race in questions of gerrymandering in district drawing. Don't know if somebody has any insight on that.
Well, I would say that the Voting Rights Act, right, set into place specific rules, and then court cases have come up that kind of have dealt with those rules, and they require the consideration of the demographic profile of a particular district when drawing districts to meet particular sets of rules. I'm not sure that is going to stand anymore after the current Supreme Court term, as they hear a case related to that. But the quality of that race data is of course important, because that's the count that the redistrictors have to use when they're generating those districts. And so getting good self-response and good race responses is crucial for that, and it definitely plays a role, for better or for worse, in the drawing of districts, both because the federal government has said it should play a role in the drawing of districts, and because the court has held that up until now, at least, that it is something to keep in mind, and that until someone says otherwise, that will continue to happen going forward.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
A few things here too, that the Census Bureau does not draw those boundaries. Just to be clear, that's usually up to the states. The Census Bureau provides that data. And also that the data collected on the census is all tied to federal law, and we don't just come up with questions that we want to include. It has to be linked to some sort of law and pass through a whole lot of bureaucratic and legislative channels. So there's a lot of scrutiny in terms of what gets, and I think some of you saw that with the census, with the citizenship question, like what could be on the form and what isn't on the form, because it could be a hotbed political topic. And then the third thing is that the use of race in some of the southern states that are, for the Voting Rights Act, that's going to the Supreme Court right now, but also part of the legislation is about this noise injection process too. So when I said we injected noise into the data, you may be changing people's race. And you may be changing then that race in certain locations. We try to make it so it balances out, and as you add up the race distribution, you get what is the most accurate, the more aggregating you do. At the low block level, which is often used for setting the political boundaries, the race distribution may be different than what was actually reported and what is in that area because of this privacy protection noise injection rule, and that's going through the courts right now. Is that noise injection process, will that pass through, and can noisy data be used in the drawing of political boundaries?
Okay, so let's turn to a next question. How quickly and how uniformly does the data reliability of the census degrade with time? And would the higher technology solutions used in 2020 make more frequent data updates feasible, even if they aren't constitutionally mandated?
That's a kind of a two-part question there.
So we want to tackle the point about degrade, for how the degrading over time first, and then maybe just the technology and updating second.
I mean, I think the answer I would give is that the census is out of date immediately upon collection, right? Because people move, right? There's mobility in the population. So, where you lived on April 1st, you could move on April 5th, and the tabulated data do not necessarily reflect reality. And we have a sense of how mobile people are in the US. And in 2020, we know, right? COVID is going to have had some impact on that, right? The enumeration went on for a lot longer than it did in prior censuses, and that's just something you have to deal with. The other products the Census Bureau publishes, for example, the American Community Survey, actually has a migration questions in it that you could use to estimate, how often do people move, and that could give you a sense of kind of that degradation. But any data collection operation, right? Once the data are collected and tabulated, they're kind of out of date, and no matter how much the tech is, it's just hard to do that because as Tim would know, that post-processing phase is really challenging and hard to do and takes time to implement correctly and well. And there's just not things you can always do to speed that up, I don't think.
We, for the 2030 census, one of our objectives this go around is to produce try to integrate something we're calling near real-time processing. So in the previous censuses, we kind of wait till we get a batch of data, and then we would process it. Now it's like as soon as we get it in-house, we're looking to process it. So we're kind of hoping that we'll be able to produce data products quicker in the future. That's one of our test objectives in the near, trying to do in 2026.
This is also relative to what your unit of analysis is and what you're interested in. If you're looking at block level data, people moving in and out, there could be quite a bit of churn. But at the state level, things are going to be a little bit more stable, and so those counts could be more invariant over a bit of time. And then it also matters if you're interested in shares of the population versus actual counts. So if you want to see what percent of the population lives in Minnesota versus how many total people are in Minnesota. Probably the shares is going to be a little bit more invariant or more timeless than the actual counts. Yeah. So it varies, I think, in terms of what you're interested in, and will be different for different users.
I mean, that seems like a more general point to appreciate, that the degree to which data are reliable or considered appropriate for answering a question will depend on what that question is, and therefore, something like the census data, you couldn't ask that in a full stop way without also understanding, well, what are you trying to do, and what are you trying to use it for? Okay, here's another question. Do we look back at prior census efforts and now see sources of error that we didn't identify at that time? So thinking about, sources of error that might have been in the 2010 census, maybe those were corrected for, or there were certain kinds of strategies to deal with them, say in the 2020 census, or even I could imagine another way of thinking about this question would be in looking at older censuses, were there ways in which you can detect that there would have been, key problems that now we know we've overcome, but maybe wouldn't have been on their radar at the time?
Maybe I'll jump in this one. So historically, for most of the U.S. history, the census was collected by some sort of enumerator. It wasn't self-response. So early on, a U.S. Marshal would come to your door, knocking on the door, and fill out the census form with you, and the Marshal would be writing down the answers, and you can look up, the data and see their handwriting of the U.S. Marshal. So if you can imagine an officer of the law coming and counting your household, how is that going to impact your willingness to respond and your accuracy of the data that you give?
Higher response rates, I would guess.
But there's another aspect where you have someone knocking on the door, and your response may be different than if you were to self-respond. People tend to feel more free in responding on their own on paper than to someone right in front of them. And it can matter all sorts of characteristics of that interviewer as well. So if I'm at your door, you might, really want to impress me and, always round your age down. Whereas if it's a census form, you're filling out on paper, you might be more accurate. Maybe, maybe not, it depends. But we've noted in earlier censuses that there was this response error, this response variance, where people would respond in different ways to different interviewers or enumerators. And that happened, I think, up through the 1950 census, and then we started to quantify that and realized that's a problem. People are responding to enumerators systematically one way. One enumerator will get one systematic set of responses and another enumerator a different one. Similar areas, similar characteristics, people would respond differently based on who was asking, who was in the household that day. So we then moved to a paper-based census, or self-response now with the internet. But that was one major source of error that was not really talked about, all the way up through like 1950. And then we saw that and we said, let's make a change.
I mean, I think back in the historical time period, you didn't actually self-identify as a particular race. The enumerator would just look at you and check off the box, because they were trained to, you didn't have to, if you didn't self-identify, they would just make that assessment, and who knows what kind of training went into that. And so the change to true self-response and self-identification has probably led to a more realistic picture of the demographic composition of America.
That's really interesting.
Give another example. For the 2010 census, we had something we called group quarters validation. It was basically between the canvassing of the country, and during the canvassing, they either select a house, an address as either a household or a group quarter, transitory location. If they were unsure of any of those three, they would mark it as other living quarter. And then all the other living quarters would go to group quarters validation. And that was a separate follow-up where we would go to that address again, and we have a long questionnaire that would figure out whether it's a housing unit or a group quarter or a transitory location. And if it was a group quarter, what kind of group quarter it was. So in 2020, we thought that our master address file was much more accurate, and we didn't need to do group quarters validation. And the end result of that was we ended up having a lot of cases misclassified. We thought the master address file has a housing unit, but it's actually a group quarter. So we had to do housing units GQV and GQ to housing unit conversions, which requires an extra visit. And if we're trying to be more efficient, we're trying to cut down on our visits. So now for 2030, we're going to re-implement the group quarters validation.
Yeah, it's a good reminder too, because I think we might always be inclined to think that in the past there were, these problems, but this is something that's being dealt with in real time with, past census and the next one coming up. Okay, I've got a question here about the PES, the post-enumeration survey. So Tim, you might want to start with this one. The PES is an internal reproducibility check. Are there sources of population data or sampling external to the US Census, say state level or city level, that the US Census uses as a check of some kind?
Yeah, so I mentioned that there are two methods we use to sort of measure or estimate the coverage of the census. One is the PES, which is your survey sample-based. The other is demographic analysis, which uses administrative records. So it uses this long-standing methodology among demographers of demographic analysis, and you basically take the births, you get birth records or counts of birth records, and then you subtract off the death records, people who have died, and then you have to deal with immigration and emigration. So you do the best job you can getting, and the Census Bureau gets data sources, talking about immigration and immigration. Some of it's from the American Community Survey and extrapolating to the population, and then they make some assumptions as well, and they produce This time around, they produced 3 series of estimates, a low, middle, and high series based on their assumptions. So they didn't say, okay, we know what the immigration is. They said, okay, if you assume a whole lot of immigration, here's your series. If you assume a little bit, here's your estimate. And if you get somewhere in the middle, here's your estimate. And they don't say which one is the truth or which one is better. There are 3 different estimates that are based on 3 different assumptions. So those are, that's a different methodology. Based on what we call demographic analysis, relying on birth certificates, death records, and then immigration statistics. And that's very useful as well, because people move a lot. After you're born, you might not be at the same place. Again, it's really hard for them to come up with state-level estimates. So that's one of the benefits of the PES, is that we have state-level estimates, but they have some other strengths in there as well, because they're not survey-based.
So, David, can I ask you to chase this with some thoughts about the relationship between, say, the US Census and its generation of the data, and then users like the Minnesota Population Center? What is the relationship between those two in terms of communication and interaction, say, leading up to the census or after a census, or at any point in time?
At the Minnesota Population Center specifically, we are mostly a consumer of census data, right? We take the data that come out and we do processing to it, and then we disseminate it to users, and users will often ask us questions. Sometimes it's related to the work that we do to enhance the data. Other times the questions are probably better suited for the Census Bureau, but we have a lot of institutional knowledge and can answer that. But we do participate in various census-related groups. So there's a ACS data users group that we have people who participate in. But we don't specifically have much to do with the run up to the decennial census. We don't play a big role in that.
Okay. So then in the I guess the procedure, there really is a generation of the data, consumption of the data.
And I think where we play a role is in because a lot of the strengths of what we do is being able to do longitudinal analysis, right? So tracking changes over time. Well, to do that, you have to know what changed, and then how does that impact the data? So between 1990 and 2000, the Census Bureau allowed people to choose, self-identify as more than one race, right? Well, that instituted a very severe disruption in the time series of, tracking individuals by race over time, because all of a sudden you can check off, I'm white and black. Well, that didn't exist in the past. So what can you do to then design statistical techniques or methods to try to make a time series that can track that over time? That's something that we would do. The Census Bureau might be interested in it, but that's not something that would tend to happen out of the Bureau, but other groups would kind of try to enhance that.
Okay.
The other thing that we do is try to work on standardizing geographies over time. So the Census Bureau, every time they do a census, they'll go out and they'll often redo some of the statistical units that the data are collected over and tabulated for. They don't always stay the same over time, but a lot of people wish they did. So we do a lot of work to try to standardize that, to make that time series analysis a little bit more to support that type of research.
So one might call that back compatibility.
Backwards
of sorts.
compatibility.
Yes.
Try to do that, and we having that historical perspective, we can become experts in that in a way that we can't become experts in the way that the operations or the post enumeration survey does. That's kind of the niche that we've carved out in our world.
Okay, I've got another question here on estimation. Regarding estimation, how are choices made to potentially overestimate or underestimate counts for particular kinds of data? And the concern is raised especially when there may be systematic errors at play. How are those choices made?
So we try to avoid biased procedures in the survey methodology, and one of the hallmarks of statistics is not really that old of a discipline, and especially surveying populations really came to fruition in the 1930s and 40s. And it used to be that people would go around and ask their neighbors, or they would try to get some government data or local city planning data and use that to make decisions. So the problem with just talking to your neighbors and your friends is that it's very biased. So recognizing that problem, people thought, okay, well, let's select the sample. Well, how do we select the sample? Well, the idea is that to do a scientific probability sample, you create a list that's as complete as possible and doesn't have any holes in it and missing people, not missing anyone, or a procedure to get to that. So it might not be that you can create a list of all the people in the country. It might be that you can sample geographies. And then within 10 geographies or 10 blocks or something in your area, you go and you create a list. So that's a lot more cost effective than getting it for the whole country. So there's not just creating a list, it's getting a methodology that is sound and will prevent you from this, having a sample that is all skewed and, only having your friends or only ending up with left-handed people or right-handed people. So we base our whole inference, so we base our estimation on this sampling methodology, which it gives everybody a chance of being selected, and then those people who fall into sample through randomization, they represent themselves and someone else, and they add up to the full population. That's sort of the estimation process through giving people these weights. Weight is how many people you represent and yourself. So you might represent 2,000 people, yourself and 1,999 other people that are similar to you, because we've gone through the randomization process of giving you a chance of selection. Now, so that's what we strive to do. It's unbiased and it's scientifically sound, and we have a whole structure around that. Now, there are times when we'll take a hit in terms of that scientific process to achieve something better or to do some goal. Like I mentioned, the synthetic estimation. Sometimes we will take a hit, like in 2010 for the state level or county estimates. People really wanted that. We promised that to the public, so we're going to do that, and we try to minimize that. And then if we can't, after minimizing it, it still exists, we quantify it and are transparent to people about that source of error. Those are errors that we can control. When I think about estimation, that's like purposefully we will inject error into the data. Like we select a sample. That adds variability, that adds error, sampling error. We do that on purpose because it would be way too expensive to do our survey for everybody, and it would be way too burdensome too. There are these other errors that we can't control. And we try to develop procedures and processes and methodologies to minimize those errors, like non-response. I can't make everybody respond, even if I have the census, which is, there's law that says you have to fill it out, but people won't fill it out anyways. So we have to live with this non-response, and we deal with it by trying to correct for that through imputation. So we're building processes to reduce or mitigate the impact of that error, and we're trying to measure it as well when we can. And then we're trying to build procedures that if there is non-response, how can we correct for that or mitigate that? So we've got all sorts of procedures for response errors, so to detect falsification. If someone's on the field in the census writing down a bunch of addresses and people's names, just hodgepodge names, they're not actually going door to door doing the knocking. We have procedures to detect that and to correct that problem. So we'll look at the GPS coordinates of where someone's at when they fill out their census, when the enumerator doing the non-response follow-up. If they're all at the same place and our enumerated 10 households all at the same place, that's a red flag. We've got all sorts of other procedures to detect falsification, to detect keying error data. When we had key data, there were we didn't just have one person keying in a census form. We would send a sample to someone else to also key, and then we'd look at those results. And if there was an error, maybe the people needed to be corrected, and we would talk to them about, okay, how can we improve your performance? So these are all things to build quality into the data collection process to minimize these non-sampling errors. When we can't actually, control them, we try to mitigate them, and then we would, build statistical processes also to fill in the gaps or to correct for errors that are, known that we can detect.
So I'm sure people have more questions for our panelists, and so I want to highlight that they will be around after we end for those who would like to ask them a few further questions. And also there are refreshments for you to do that over. But before we close the evening, I want to do two things. The first is I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise with us tonight. Definitely insight that we wouldn't otherwise have without them being here with us and coming from Washington, D.C. in two of the cases. The second thing is we would appreciate any feedback you have about the event. And so there is a link there on the slide for you to give feedback. You can either do it now off of your smartphone, or the same link will be available at the reproducibility.umn.edu website. So you can go there later if you'd prefer to do that. But we'd really appreciate your input, because that helps us shape further events in the future, tweak them and make them better. And that's one of the things that we would like to do, and can do it with your feedback. So with that, I will bring things to a close, and thank you very much for coming.